Thank you for joining us for this special recorded webinar on using our new fundraising resources. My name's Alice and I'm a lawyer in the not-for-profit law team at Justice Connect. And I'm also joined by my colleague Caroline Baker, who's our online services lawyer responsible for keeping our free resources up to date and relevant for the sector. I'm recording today from Yagara and Turrbal country. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for the care they've taken for these lands for thousands of years. It's a privilege to live alongside one of the oldest civilisations on the planet.
Thanks, Alice. I'm pleased to join you today from the lands of the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, whose enduring connection to the waters of Nurm, Port Phillip Bay, shapes the places where I live and work.
So why have we developed this webinar? Well, we know a few things about fundraising law after operating our not-for-profit law service for over 15 years. First, we know that fundraising laws are really complicated and people tell us all the time that they can be stressful to navigate. Second, in recent years, there have been a number of changes to fundraising laws and it can be hard to keep up to date. And third, not-for-profits want to comply with the law, but it can be difficult to know where to start. So this is why we've recently redeveloped our free fundraising resources to make it easier for you to find the answers to your questions and get back to your core missions of serving communities in need. So this is what we'll cover in this webinar. First, we're going to begin by giving you a refresher on how fundraising is regulated in Australia. We'll talk about some key things to know about fundraising laws and also what has changed in recent years. Then we'll show you how we've improved our fundraising resources to reflect these recent changes and make them easier to use. And then we'll finish up by using 3 fictional case studies to show you how to use our resources to find answers to common questions. So by the end of the webinar, we hope that you'll feel more confident to use our free resources to understand and comply with the law. It really does take a village to raise a new suite of resources, so I wanted to say a huge thank you to our funders and also the law firm Spark Helmore Lawyers, who provided pro bono legal help that supported the development of these resources. I also want to remind you that this webinar contains general information and is not legal advice. You should seek legal advice about your own particular circumstances. Before we get into the rest of the content, just a quick reminder about who we are and what we do. Not-for-profit law is a specialised legal program of the legal charity called Justice Connect. We're here to help your organisations, not-for-profits, charities and social enterprises in a number of different ways. So first of all, we have a number of free resources on our website and we'll be focusing, of course, on our fundraising resources today. For eligible organisations, we can help with legal inquiries in-house or through referral to one of our pro bono member law firms. We also advocate for changes to the laws that impact the not-for-profit and charity sector. For example, you may be familiar with our long-standing campaign to fix fundraising laws. And finally, we also run a certified social enterprise, providing easy to understand legal training and webinars with any profits going back into Justice Connect to help continue its social justice work. So let's start with an overview of how fundraising is regulated in Australia and what recent changes you should be aware of. So any person who's sat down and tried to understand their obligations under fundraising laws knows what a maze our legal system is. We could run a whole 3-hour training session on fundraising laws. The purpose today is not to give you the ins and outs of every aspect of these laws. Rather, what we want to do is empower you to use our free resources to find the answers to your questions yourself. In order to show you around our resources, we need to share some basic facts about how fundraising is regulated in Australia. So there are 5 key things that we want to explain, and we'll go through them each one by one. So the first key thing to know is that there is no national fundraising law in Australia. Rather, each state and territory, except for the Northern Territory, has its own fundraising laws. So these laws are overseen and enforced by state regulators, as you can see on the slide. The second key thing to know is that an organisation may need a licence to fundraise. Depending on what state or territory you're in, That license might also be called an authority or a permit. If you're watching this webinar, you might be struggling to work out whether your organisation actually needs one or more fundraising licenses. So broadly speaking, there are 5 things to consider when you're trying to work out if you need a licence. So first, consider which state or territory the fundraising is taking place in. Second, consider the type of fundraising activity. Does it fall within the relevant definition of fundraising in that particular state or territory? Now, because we have different laws in each state and territory, there is no one single definition of fundraising. And in fact, some laws don't even call it fundraising. They might instead call it collecting, making an appeal for support, or soliciting. Generally speaking, though, fundraising refers to activities to raise money to help a person, cause, or organisation. Common examples of fundraising include asking for donations, door knocking, and holding fundraising events. However, there may be some things that count as fundraising in some states, but not in others. The next thing to consider is the purpose of the fundraising. So usually a fundraising licence is needed to fundraise for a charitable purpose. But some laws cast a wider net to include community purposes or purposes that are philanthropic, benevolent, or patriotic. Now, if you're not fundraising for one of these regulated purposes, then you don't need a licence. The fourth thing to consider is the amount of money being raised. So some laws have exemptions for small fundraisers, namely New South Wales, Victoria, and the Australian Capital Territory. This means that an organisation won't need a licence if it raises less than the threshold amount in that state and doesn't pay people to carry out the fundraising. And finally, consider whether any other exemptions apply. Some states and territories also have exemptions for certain types of organisations, such as educational or religious organisations. Our resources cover this in much more detail. The third thing to know about fundraising laws is that if your organisation is fundraising interstate, nationally, or online, you may need multiple licences. So you should consider the state or territory where you make the request for a donation, where that request is received, where the donation occurs, and where the donation is received. So, for example, let's imagine a national not-for-profit organisation working to end homelessness that's based in Sydney. It sends a fundraising email from its Sydney office to subscribers on its list in Tasmania. The organisation may technically be fundraising in Tasmania as well as New South Wales. And to take this example further, if the organisation put a donate button on its website, it may technically be fundraising in every state and territory. Our resources look at this in much more detail and also give some tips and tricks as to how to make compliance easier when you're fundraising interstate or online. The fourth thing we want to remind you is that getting a licence isn't the end of the story. Organisations that fundraise will have ongoing responsibilities. So, for example, about how they conduct their fundraising, how they manage the funds they raise, and how they keep records. Your organisation's specific obligations will depend on a number of factors, including, of course, the state or territory that you're fundraising in, noting that if you fundraise interstate or nationally, you might have multiple overlapping obligations. Your obligations will also depend on whether your organisation has a fundraising licence. Although it's important to know that even if your organisation doesn't need a licence, you may still need to comply with some rules. And finally, your obligations will depend on whether your organisation is a registered charity. So this factor has in recent years become particularly significant. Let's have a look now at some recent changes for registered charities. So the fifth and final thing we want to tell you about fundraising laws is that there have been recent changes for registered charities. In other words, charities that are registered with the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, or the ACNC for short. The ACNC is our federal regulator of charities. So as a result of these changes, in most states and territories, it's now easier for registered charities to get a fundraising licence and meet their reporting obligations. Overall, we think these changes are really positive, and we're proud to say that they're a direct result of the Fix fundraising campaign that Justice Connect has played a leading role in. Let's learn a bit more on the next slide. So we've seen that fundraising laws are really complex in Australia. If you're finding it hard to navigate through the maze, you're definitely not alone. That's why for 10 years we've campaigned to fix fundraising laws and get some consistency or harmonisation across the different laws. There have been 3 pillars or 3 parts to our Fix fundraising campaign. The first pillar is that we think it should be simpler for a charity to get permission to fundraise across Australia. The reality is, in 2026, most fundraising happens online or beyond state borders. A charity shouldn't have to make 7 different applications for a licence just to have a Donate Now button on its website. So the good news is that in every state and territory now, except for Western Australia and Tasmania, it's now much simpler for a registered charity to get a fundraising licence. For example, in many states, all a charity needs to do is notify the state regulator that it intends to fundraise in that state, and then it will be deemed to have a fundraising licence in that state. So Tasmania and Western Australian governments are currently in the process of implementing this change, and we hope that it will become law soon there as well. The second pillar of the campaign to harmonise fundraising laws is that charities should just need to report to the ACNC. So in the past, a charity fundraising across Australia might need to report annually to the ACNC as well as up to 7 different state and territory regulators. So we're pleased to say now, as a result of recent reforms, if a charity submits its annual report to the ACNC, it will not need to lodge separate annual reports with the state regulators. And the final third pillar is that a charity, no matter where in Australia it's fundraising, should only have to comply with one set of rules, the National Fundraising Principles. So remember, getting a licence is not the end of the story. Each state and territory has its own set of rules that an organisation then needs to follow when it fundraises. So this becomes especially complicated for charities that fundraise nationally or online and therefore have up to 7 sets of laws they need to comply with when fundraising. The National Fundraising Principles represent an opportunity to harmonise these rules. So how is this going in practice? Well, unfortunately, progress on this third pillar has been much slower. Let's take a moment to talk more about what the National Fundraising Principles are and how they're being rolled out across Australia. So in early 2023, the state and territory governments agreed to implement a nationally consistent set of fundraising principles and work together to create some accompanying guidance for charities. The National Fundraising Principles are designed to make fundraising compliance easier for busy charities, and they recognise the modern reality that many charities are fundraising online or interstate. Instead of complying with overlapping state rules, charities should just have to comply with a single set of modern, fit-for-purpose rules wherever they fundraise in Australia. So the table on the slide gives you an idea of what those principles cover. And really, at the end of the day, they boil down to making fundraising clear, honest, and respectful. So, for example, principles 1, 2, 4, and 9 are really about asking charities to explain their purpose in plain terms, make their fundraisers easy to identify, and be upfront about how donations work. For a further example, principles 6, 7, 8, and 10 set expectations for fair behaviour. So not putting pressure on people when fundraising, not providing misleading information, not taking advantage of vulnerable people, and providing clear disclosure when a charity might be using a commercial fundraiser. So you can read the principles in full, either on our website or in our fundraising guide. So those are the principles. How are the states and territories going? Have the principles actually been implemented? Unfortunately, after 3 years, our progress is still painfully slow. On the slide, you can see our report card, and you'll see that only 4 states have currently implemented the principles: South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, and the ACT. And while it's fantastic that these 4 states are leading the way and have implemented the principles, unfortunately, they haven't implemented them in a way that fully supports harmonisation. And the reason for this is because they've only repealed or switched off some of their local fundraising rules. So what that means is that charities in these states now need to comply with the national fundraising principles and some local state rules. And in some cases, charities actually need to meet notification requirements in order to get the benefit of the local laws that have been repealed or switched off. So remember, there is no national fundraising law, so the only way to achieve harmonisation is for the states to work together to implement these reforms consistently. So for more information about the progress of the other states, have a look at the fixed fundraising page on our website. And again, just a reminder that the Northern Territory doesn't currently regulate fundraising, which is why the table says not applicable for the Northern Territory. So it's clear that the states and territories have a lot of work to do to implement the principles properly in order for charities to reap the benefits of this long-awaited reform. But in the meantime, you might be wondering, what do the national fundraising principles mean for you? So in South Australia, New South Wales and the ACT, your organisation must comply with the national fundraising principles if it holds a fundraising licence or other authority to fundraise. If your organisation is a registered charity, it may be eligible to comply with a reduced set of local fundraising requirements. In Victoria, if your organisation is a registered charity, it must comply with the national fundraising principles and may be eligible to comply with a reduced set of local fundraising requirements. Contact your state regulator if you're a registered charity and you need further guidance on which local fundraising requirements continue to apply to your organisation.
Right, having set up the current fundraising law landscape, next we'll show you the improvements we've made to our fundraising law resources and how to use them in practice. For a long time, we had a national guide to fundraising laws along with separate guides for each state and territory. As the national fundraising principles have been rolled out across Australia, we updated our resources to reflect changes. However, because the principles have been implemented differently across states and territories, that fundraising laws could still be difficult to navigate, particularly if you weren't sure where to start. So with the benefit of generous funding, we've had the opportunity to take a fresh look at our resources and rethink how we present this information. And as a result, here's what we've done. First, we brought everything together in one place. We've retired the separate state and territory guides and put that content into a single improved national resource. So now you only have to go to one place to find the information you're looking for. Second, we've introduced a new set of web pages built around the 12 most common fundraising questions we are asked. The aim is to make it easier to get orientated quickly without having to read everything from start to finish. These pages guide you to the key information and point you to where you can go next, particularly if you're looking for more detail. So if you're not quite sure where to begin, these questions are a good entry point. You can start with a question, get a clear summary, and then follow the links into more detailed guidance if that will help. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that this is still an evolving area. The national fundraising principles continue to be rolled out, so we'll keep updating the content as things change. Our aim is for these resources to remain current and reliable over time. We're going to take you to our fundraising webpage now, which you can find in the free resources section of our not-for-profit law website under the fundraising and holding events topic. On that page, you will see the 12 common fundraising questions listed, each linking to a dedicated page with an answer. Beneath the list of questions, There is a link to download our updated National Guide to Fundraising Laws in Australia.
Let's hop back to our slides now. We'll come back to the website and show you how to use those resources in more detail soon. So we've given you a short introduction to fundraising laws in Australia, and we've shown you how we've redesigned our resources to make them more relevant and user-friendly. Now we want to show you how you can use these resources in practice. We've developed 3 fictional questions, and we're going to show you in real time how you can navigate through our resources to find some answers. So this is our first case study. It involves a fictional group called the Placedael Community Shed, Inc. This newly established community shed seeks to improve the mental health of community members in Placedael, a regional New South Wales town, by creating a welcoming space for people to work on projects alongside each other. The shed wants to raise funds for equipment by applying for government grants, increasing membership fees, and holding sausage sizzles. So the shed's questions are, first of all, is the shed fundraising? And second of all, does it need a license? So I will now share my screen. We'll have a look back at the website and we'll see if we can use the resources to find some answers for the community shed. So Caroline, where would you begin?
I would start by going to our fundraising landing page and looking at the list of common questions. The key is to see whether there's a question that with what we're asking. So in this case, let's start with the question, what is fundraising?
So let's have a look at this page. Remember, the shed wants to fundraise by applying for government grants, increasing membership fees, and holding sausage sizzles. So scrolling down and reading this page, I can see in this description of what fundraising is that regulated fundraising activities commonly include face-to-face appeals, direct marketing, community gaming, commercial activities, and online appeals. So I think that that covers the sausage sizzle. So a sausage sizzle, I suppose, is a kind of commercial activity where the proceeds from the sale go towards a cause. But I don't think that general description really captures the other 2 proposed activities of applying for government grants and increasing membership fees. So Caroline, what are the shed's options from here? Should we go back to the list of commonly asked questions or should we head to the guide?
Let's stay with the questions for now, because they've been designed to help us narrow things down.
Okay. Here we are.
Right, so let's look at the second question, which is what fundraising activities are not regulated under fundraising laws?
Okay. So under this description, I can see there are some subheadings describing activities that aren't regulated. I can see, for example, here, it says activities that are restricted to an organisation's existing members or employees often fall outside the scope of fundraising laws. For example, requests for membership, joining or renewal fees are excluded in New South Wales. So that answers that first question of whether it's fundraising to charge or increase membership fees. In New South Wales, it's not a regulated fundraising activity. So let's continue down the page. We see here that financial support from institutional sources is typically not defined as fundraising. For example, seeking or receiving money, goods or benefits from a Commonwealth, state or local government authority is not considered a regulated collection. So applying for government grants is not a type of regulated fundraising. So what that means, Caroline, for our shed is that the only fundraising activity that counts as fundraising under New South Wales law is the sausage sizzle. Does the shed need a licence for that? Where do you think we should go next?
At this point, there are a few possible directions. I'd focus on whether the sausage sizzle might fall into an exemption, particularly by looking at how much the shed expects to raise from the sausage sizzle and whether the activity would fall into any exemptions under New South Wales law.
Yeah, great. And where would we find that information?
So that's where the guide is useful because it sets out state-specific information in more detail.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I've still got the guide open here, so let's have a look. I'll scroll down to look at the table of contents. So the question the organisation has about is whether it needs a licence. And we can see that there is information about the laws in each state and territory here. So let's navigate to the New South Wales section of the guide. So I can see there's some introductory information here, and there's a paragraph here about exempt organisations. So this paragraph reads, there are certain types of organisations that are exempt from the requirement to hold a fundraising authority, even if they conduct regulated fundraising activities. And that includes small fundraisers. So organisations or individuals that receive less than $15,000 in a financial year from fundraising, provided that they don't receive remuneration for the activity other than lawful and proper expenses in line with New South Wales fair trading determinations, and only use volunteers. So we know that the only fundraising activity that's regulated under New South Wales law is the sausage sizzle. And from reading this, I can conclude that if the shed fundraises less than $15,000 per financial year via its sausage sizzles, and it only uses volunteers to conduct that fundraising, then it will be exempt from holding a licence.
Yes, that's right. But it's important to note that even if the shed doesn't need a licence for the sausage sizzle, it may still have other ongoing obligations. And they can find more information about these obligations on our website or in the guide.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Let's have a look back to our slides and explore our second fictional case study. Okay, so this case study involves a fictional organisation called Rare Genes Limited. This Victorian-based not-for-profit supports people across Australia living with a rare genetic condition. The organisation wants to run a social media fundraising campaign and put a donate button on its website. So their question is, does the organisation need a licence to fundraise online? So let's head back to our list of common fundraising questions. Here they are now. Which questions do you think would be most useful for Rare Genes Limited?
The ninth question is right on point, and that is, does an organisation need a fundraising licence to fundraise on its website, on social media, or through an email campaign?
Right. So we can see that this page begins by telling us that online fundraising is just as susceptible to state and territory fundraising laws as door knocking. Because the internet crosses borders, an online appeal is often technically taking place in multiple states and territories simultaneously, requiring compliance with different local laws. And the laws that apply depend on where the fundraising activity is considered to be taking place. So the page then expands on some of the issues we've already discussed in this webinar. It explains that online fundraising can potentially occur in multiple states and territories, depending on factors like where the request for a donation is made, where that request for a donation is received, where the donation is made, and where the donation is received. So, Caroline, it seems there's a real possibility that Rare Genes' plan to fundraise through its website and social media could trigger fundraising laws in multiple jurisdictions.
Yes, that's correct. What's helpful here is that the page doesn't just identify the problem, it also directs you to where you can get further information. So to investigate whether the organisation needs a fundraising licence in each state or territory, there's a link to the question, does a fundraiser need a fundraising licence? And then to explore whether AC&C charity registration could simplify compliance, there's a link to the question, does a charity registered with the AC&C need a fundraising licence? The page also finishes with some practical tips for managing the administrative burden of fundraising across multiple jurisdictions. For example, organisations may be able to reduce their compliance burden by clearly stating which states and territories their fundraising appeal relates to on their campaign materials.
Thanks, Caroline. So Regenes Limited still has some homework to do, and there are a few decisions it will need to make. But what this page does really well is it helps the organisation to, first of all, identify the key legal issues that arise when fundraising online, and second of all, to work out which resources to look at next. So rather than trying to answer every question at once, these pages help the organisation understand the landscape and navigate to the information that's most relevant to its circumstances. Let's finish with our third case study. Caroline, would you mind reading this one out for us?
Sure, Alice. This case study poses the concept of a volunteer-run charity that's called Little Creek Bush Care, Inc. It's located in the ACT and it exists to protect and restore the local creek and surrounding ecosystems. The group is planning its first fundraising events, and these include a door-knocking drive and a stall at the local market. The group has a fundraising license, but is not sure what other rules it needs to follow. So what are the group's obligations when fundraising?
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go back to our list of commonly asked questions. So I'll get that page back up. Here's our landing page, and we'll scroll down to those questions here. So here, Little Creek Bush Care is already a registered charity and it holds a fundraising license. So its question is, what are the group's obligations when it fundraises? So where do you think the best place to start is?
So it looks as if the best place to start is the question, what are the obligations of an AC&C registered charity with a fundraising license?
Fantastic. Let's go there. So this page tells us that an ACNC registered charity with a fundraising license or authority is subject to a number of ongoing obligations that affect how it conducts its authorised fundraising activity, including general conduct standards and specific state-based legislative requirements. While the national fundraising principles aim to harmonise these rules, charities must still adhere to specific local laws regarding identification, financial management and reporting. So the page then explains that it provides a high-level summary only and that each state and territory still has its own requirements. So what I like about this page is that it gives a useful overview of the key things that organisations need to know about. So, for example, it starts by covering the national fundraising principles, and then it moves on to summarise some key obligations that organisations have under the different state and territory rules. So, for example, obligations to identify collectors, rules around permissible times for appeals, rules around financial management and record keeping, reporting obligations, protection of children, and finally some information about collection receptacles. So, Caroline, this is a really great starting point, but let's say Little Creek Bush Care is only fundraising face-to-face in the ACT and it wants to know exactly what rules apply there. So where should it go next to find that information?
For that level of detail, I'd move on from the common questions to the complete guide for fundraising laws in Australia. The common questions are designed to help organisations identify issues while the guide is where you'll find more detailed state and territory information.
Okay, so I've got the guide open here. So this is the table of contents. The part that we need, I think, is part 4, ongoing obligations while fundraising. So by looking at the table of contents here, we can see that this part 4 begins with an introduction to general ongoing obligations. It then looks at other laws and standards which may apply. It considers the national fundraising principles. So this is where you can see the principles written out in full, and you can get some more detailed information about where those national fundraising principles apply. And then finally, we have information about ongoing obligations under the different state and territory fundraising laws. And the Bush Care Group can go directly to this section on the Australian Capital Territory to find out more about the rules in place there. So once again, there's a bit of homework here for the organisation to do, but what the guide does is it narrows down where to look. So rather than reading the entire guide from cover to cover, Little Creek Bush Care can first of all use the website and then the table of contents in the guide to quickly identify the topics that matter and then go straight to that ACT section for the detail it needs. In particular, this part of the guide will help the organisation understand whether the national fundraising principles apply to its activities and what additional ACT requirements it may need to comply with. So we just mentioned that there are other laws that can apply to your fundraising. Our fundraising guide in that part 4 does give a really good overview of the types of laws you might need to consider. Things like local council laws, privacy laws, child safety laws as well. So definitely start by having a look at that section of the guide. And then remember that there are a lot of other fact sheets on our website that might support you. We have a few examples here on the screen, so that we have fact sheets on holding events in different states and territories, fact sheets on conducting raffles and trade promotion lotteries, and a fact sheet on gifts, wills, bequests and endowments, which of course is another way of raising funds. So that brings us to the end of this special webinar on fundraising laws. What have we covered? Well, we began with a refresher on how fundraising is regulated, with a focus on key changes in recent years. Then Caroline explained how we've improved our fundraising resources to reflect these recent changes and make the resources easier to use. Then we finished up by using 3 fictional case studies to show you how to use our resources to find answers to common questions. Now, as we've seen, this is a really complex landscape. I'm sure most of you watching will still have questions, but we hope that you now feel more confident to use our resources to find the guidance that you need. If you've reviewed our resources and you still have questions, you're welcome to check our website to see if your organisation is eligible for free legal advice. We've circled that part of the website you need to go to. It's the section called Get Help from a Lawyer. So just 3 short notes before we wrap up for good. First of all, we're going to publish a downloadable copy of these webinar slides so that you can click through all of the hyperlinks that we've provided throughout on the slides. Second of all, we'd be really grateful for feedback about how our resources have helped your organisations and any suggestions you might have for improving them. We're going to be publishing a link to a feedback survey on the website. And finally, we also provide updates about changes to fundraising law in our website. As we've seen, this is an area of law that is regularly changing, so please sign up to our newsletter to stay in the loop and keep up to date. And that's it from Caroline and I. Thank you very much for attending, and we hope this webinar has helped you.